Right. So now in this section, we're going to talk about racism as a system, these systems that we've all been born into. We don't get to choose, how we're born into, but we need to understand that the systems that we're born into, how they affect us, how they oppress us, first how they privilege us, and how we can, dismantle these systems. I really like this quote. I'm going to start off this section reading this. I say this in my classes: the problem isn't men, it's patriarchy. The problem isn't white people, it's white supremacy. The problem isn't straight people, it's homophobia. Recognize systems of oppression before letting individual defensiveness paralyze you from dismantling them. I really like that idea that, a lot of times it's really easy just to, like toxic masculinity is just, an outcome of the system of patriarchy. White supremacists are just an outcome of system of white supremacy. It's easy to kind of just focus, on those individual acts, and we should still do that. We should confront that, but at the same time, we need to understand that, there's also a lot of bigger things, happening, that is happening in these systems that are beyond just these individual acts. All right, so we're going to start off, with a video from Dr. Robin DiAngelo, kind of talking about, racism as a system.
To see that as non-operative. I now understand racism as a system, as a deeply embedded system, a system that our country was founded on, and that all our institutions were created out of. And every institution reinforces this system. And it's a system of unequal power. So let me give you an example. Women in the United States got the right to vote in 1920. And there was only one possible way that we could have gotten the right to vote, and that was for men to give it to us, because we literally were not sitting in the seats of institutional power. We could not give ourselves the right to vote. That doesn't mean that we couldn't have personal power, but we didn't have institutional power. And that's the difference between a system and individual acts. Prior to women's suffrage, I could certainly discriminate against men. I could be unfair to individual men, but my group could not systematically deny men as a group the right to vote. And men controlled all the institutions, and they all worked together to convey the message that women's place was here and men's place was there. And that's the difference between individual prejudice and a system of inequality. So in this field, we think about oppression, or in this case, racism, as group prejudice backed by institutional power. And so prior.
Right. So the institutions that Dr. Robin DiAngelo were talking about, we could define these institutions, these systems, in multiple different ways. And I'm going to go over a couple different definitions that we could talk about. But reality, there are differences with each one of these definitions, but the reality is a lot of times these are used interchangeably, and you can, and the point is you can still get the point. You still get what people are talking about. But there are little specific things with each one of these definitions, so I want to kind of just dive a little bit into three of them. The first one I'll talk about is systemic racism, or oftentimes called structural racism. And this is the idea that racism, these are systems that are ingrained in every system of our society. The idea that racism is in, our schools, it's in our media, but it's also in our biases. It's also in our families and friends and community centers. Community groups. It's also in governments and laws in our history. So it's in every aspect of our society: cultural, political, economically, etc. So, for example, like talking about like the racial wealth gap, like white people have 16 times this amount of wealth as black people. That wasn't the direct result of one policy or several policies. That was a direct result of 400 years of racist policies and white supremacy actions. So that is what we're talking about, systemic. That it's touching everything. Same with racial bias. The biases that we have isn't a result of one policy or one, like textbook in the school. It's a result of the whole world that we're absorbing right now. And we're going to talk more about this in another class, about how we internalize and socialize these systems and this media, this culture, unconsciously. At the same time, so the next thing we have is institutional racism, and this is also oftentimes used, very similarly as systemic and structural. With that definition that racism equals power plus privilege, institutional power plus privilege. That definition, they're definitely using that more as systemic and structural racism. But sometimes people, use institutional racism for more of a specific thing, and that's oftentimes when we're looking at the exact policies of institutions. And how they push racist outcomes. It's like school disciplinary policies. A lot of times they don't factor in racism. They don't factor the fact that police in schools and white teachers often have a racial bias. That causes more harsher disciplinary policy actions to students of color for same for the same punishments, same actions that white students are doing. Or the criminal justice system, there's very specific parts of that create racial outcomes. Or banking discrimination, there's very specific policies in that institution that push racist outcomes. So that's oftentimes when people say institutional power, they're more talking about specific policies and practices across institutions. But again, a lot of times people will use this interchangeably with systemic racism and structural racism. And then you have white supremacy. So this is again, we talked about this. Our dictionaries do a really poor job defining these definitions. But a lot of people think when they hear white supremacy, they think personal beliefs. We're just talking about white supremacy. We're talking about a bunch of white supremacists that believe that they're superior and black people are inferior, and white people should But if you look at go back to the beginning of the presentation about all the just the horrific racial disparities that are happening in this country. Like, that's not because a bunch of white people believe white people are better. That's, because white supremacy is really about a system. White supremacy, white supremacists are one outcome of white supremacy, but so is, racial wealth gap. So is, housing discrimination. So is, a criminal justice system that's based on black criminality. So we have to understand these. When we say white supremacy, we're talking about systems, like these automatic systems, regardless if you believe in it, regardless if you agree with it, you think you're part of it, regardless if you're even aware of it. But it's these automatic systems that benefit white people politically, economically, socially, culturally, at the expense and oftentimes exploitation of marginalized people of color, marginalized Black, Indigenous people of color. So we have to see these, these as these automatic. I think that's one of the most important part about these systems is these are automatic systems that they're going to happen regardless if you agree with it, regardless if you think you're part of it. You may think you're the most woke person in the world, and you're not. You don't do anything. But racist, but you're still part of the system that perpetuates it, and it's automatically benefiting white people, not automatically disenfranchising oppressing people of color. Or Black people, Indigenous people of color. So I'm going to play another video that's going to kind of dive a little bit more on like kind of nuts and bolts of how institutional racism actually works.
This is Michael Jackson's controversial song, They Don't Really Care About Us. It talks about racial inequality, brutality against Blacks. Civil rights champion Martin Luther King. It's still relevant today. Here's how. With the Civil Rights Act of 1968, legal forms of racism were abolished, but it didn't actually end racism in the US. It's not only about forced segregation or slurs or lynching. Professor David T. Wellman defines racism as, quote, culturally sanctioned beliefs, which, regardless of intentions involved, defend the advantages whites have because of the subordinated position of racial minorities. So, let's talk about institutional racism. It's what blocks access to opportunities for people of color. Professor Tricia Rose identifies 5 social institutions that produce and keep racial inequalities going, either intentionally or unintentionally, through housing, education, criminal justice system, media, and wealth. Housing disparity leads to low taxes, which leads to poor schooling, which leads to low education and dropouts and blacks entering the criminal justice system. And because of the media and prejudice, they receive longer sentences and can't get jobs when they're finally released, which leads to poorer communities, which leads to housing disparities, which leads to, you see the cycle there? So let's start at the top. Today, the average white family owns 700% more wealth than a black family. A study by Brandeis University found that this disparity is due to the institutionalized racism in housing. You see, for decades, the Federal Housing Authority wouldn't grant mortgage loans to people of color. They'd rank all the neighborhoods in the country according to their loan eligibility, and black neighborhoods were marked red and assigned the lowest grade. Later, this rating system was taken up by banks and other institutions which denied home and business loans to people of color. This is called redlining, and although it's now illegal, the damage is still being felt today. Blacks couldn't get loans to buy property in their neighborhoods, and white real estate owners known as blockbusters held all the deeds. Without access to loans, black neighborhoods couldn't thrive. Homes weren't renovated, new businesses weren't opened, and existing ones weren't being expanded. It's what created ghettos and generational poverty. Property values and the lack of prospering businesses meant that local tax collections were low. With nearly half of a school's budget coming from local taxes, education in these areas suffered. And when schools don't have enough funding, they can't open kindergartens or hire qualified teachers. So class sizes swell, and schools don't offer electives and upper AP classes. This education system not only fails students of color through inadequate resources, it also creates a school-to-jail track. Statistics on suspension rates from kindergarten through high school, black kids are suspended and expelled from school far more often than white kids. Expelled students have a higher chance of being arrested or ending up in juvenile detention centers, where they're introduced into the criminal justice system, which again is skewed against people of color. The number of black convictions are much higher than white convictions for the same crimes. Black people make up only 13% of the US population, but they're 40% of the US prison population. Why? It's all about perception. Black people are perceived as criminals. And this stereotype of black people as brutes became especially popular in 1915 with the movie The Birth of a Nation, praising the Ku Klux Klan's protection of white women from the sexual aggressions of free black men. The movie was screened at the White House, and President Woodrow Wilson reportedly said the film was, quote, like writing history with lightning, and its depictions were all so terribly true. And these perceptions have carried on. Interestingly enough, the US prison population skyrocketed after the Civil Rights Act, mostly caused by the US's war on drugs, which, according to former Nixon advisor, was created to target black communities and hippies. And today, even though whites and blacks use drugs at similar rates, people of color are far more likely to be prosecuted and receive harsher sentences for non-violent drug-related crimes. 13% of drug users are black, but 36% of people arrested and 46% of people convicted of drug-related offenses are people of color. At the current rate of arrests, 1 out of every 3 black males will go to jail at some point in their lives. And when they get out, they'll earn 21% less in wages than formerly incarcerated white people, which feeds into poverty, which feeds into housing, which feeds into schools, which feeds into prisons, which was fed by the media, and round it goes. 66% of the overall population and 70% of the white population think racism is individual rather than being built into laws and institutions. What do you think?
Right. So that video talked a lot about the specific impacts and how they kind of connect with each other. So we'll just go over some of them. When we're talking about systemic racism, I mean, some of the places that it appears. A big one is just a lack of access. even though, like, we've had all these civil rights bills, and we say, anyone can do anything, we got rid of, racist barriers, but at the same time, these systemic racism is still affecting people's access to equal education. White schools get, I think that statistic at the beginning class, something like, billions, tens of billions of dollars more money than schools, within communities of color. Political representation. We talked about, we saw those stats from about just how the majority of our government is white. It's extremely hard to get, more, Black, Indigenous people of color, especially Black, progressive Black, Indigenous people of color. They're going to be pushing, anti-racist policies, to get them into Congress. It's a big deal. Economic opportunities, housing, social opportunities, healthcare. A lot of this comes around with our segregation. Segregation isn't so much about, denying diversity. It's more about, denying economic opportunities, putting, Black, Indigenous people of color into poor neighborhoods and concentrated poverty where they don't have, decent access to education and healthcare and things like that. And it's a systemic racism that still keeps people into these areas of concentrated poverty. A lot of times it exposes, people more to racism and discrimination, racial brutality, police brutality. Is a direct result of the systems that force that. There are, especially if you look at, policing, that there are some, we talk about good or bad cops, and this is a bad cop thing, but even the good cops aren't, that wouldn't brutalize, stay silent about that, because there's so many mechanisms to, and not only, with consequences, where if they do, whistleblow, they can lose promotions, they can, get fired, lose their job, they even get killed. If you look at the handful of whistleblowing cops over the last couple of decades, horrific things happen to them, so there's, and that's because the whole system of policing is systemic. It produces, it supports and racist outcomes, and then produces punishments and negative consequences for anyone going against that. Even like biased treatment, like teachers, we have tons of data that teachers treat, kids of color differently, or more, especially Black girls, expecting them to be more adult-like, while giving white girls more of the benefit of doubt of being a child, and giving them more patience. We have more extreme, punishments, for Black children, as opposed to white children with doing the same actions. And we see this play out with how police, and police are more likely to pull people over who are Black, Indigenous people of color. Judges are more likely to give longer sentences. Juries are more likely to convict. Bankers are more likely to deny loans or give toxic loans, like the subprime loans, to people, to Black, Indigenous people of color. And it just goes on. Employers are more likely to hire people, with white sounding names, give them chances. Unions are, you're easier to get a union when you're a white person. So it just goes on and on. Even doctors don't believe Black people's, pain, don't believe Black people when they say they're experiencing pain and their symptoms, as much as they believe white people. And there's tons of data kind of packing that stuff. At the same time, we have, these systems enforce this, like white supremacy internalizations. So part of the system of white supremacy is it creates, culturally, it creates, it comes out culturally to what we consider to be normal, what we consider to be good. White people are judged as individuals. If a white person, doesn't, kill and rampage, he's just like a lone wolf. He's an individual that did something horrible. Let's just judge him, not the entire white race. But then, like if a Black Muslim, does an act of terrorism, then that's proof that the whole, all Black Muslims have a terrorist culture. So, so what is, white is good and safe. We teach white history, Eurocentric white history, as our norm. Like a lot of times when you're like, being white means we don't have to we don't even have to have that, we're just normal. We don't even have to say that's a white person. You just say that's a person. But then when with people, Black, Indigenous people of color, like a lot of times Black is considered bad. That they're judged as groups. When they commit, a Black person commits a crime, it's more of a reflection of Black culture and not just of an individual or lone wolf. Black people were more dangerous, because they didn't criminalize, they have this myth of being criminalized throughout our history, our country. So there's more, there's this internalized fear. So it's part of our culture, what's good and bad and beautiful and ugly. Like if you Google, the word beauty, you'll see tons of white people show up. If you Google the word Jesus, you'll see, tons of, images of white Jesus. Same with millionaires, billionaires, politicians. But if you Google, criminal, you're going to start seeing more Black photos. If you Google, unprofessional haircut, you'll see a lot more Black photos. And that's because even our beauty standards and our professional standards are based on what white people look like. So anyone that's biologically not, meant not to look like a white person is all of a sudden considered unprofessional, when in fact, that's how they look. And that's our culture, our white supremacy culture. There's nothing unprofessional about that. In real life, our white supremacy culture makes that unprofessional. So, and same with preservation inequalities, the racial wealth gaps, the segregation, the concentration of poverty, the mass incarceration, it's all based on systemic racism and policies of systemic racism throughout the last 400 years of our country. And we see this play out, in our justice system, our police, housing markets, immigration, healthcare, our hospitals, where people are getting longer sentences, getting denied home loans, getting denied job interviews. There's all the studies on that's been done, huge amount of studies where they've sent resumes, with the same exact resume, but just had a white sounding name and Black sounding name to employers. And it's like conservative end, I've seen 2 to 3 times more likely the white sounding name is going to get a job or get called for an interview than a Black sounding name. And I've even seen, other ones were like 10 to 20 times more likely. And that's not because, there's a bunch of racist Klansmen in our HR departments. That's because it's full of white people who grew up in a white supremacy society and absorbed all these internalizations and these biases from their schools and their curriculum and their family and church and friends and community, and they absorbed all this stuff to where they're just like, well, it just feel like something inside just feel like that resume with a white sounding name is just a little bit more qualified, maybe a little bit more reliable, maybe a little less risky, and that is what how this plays out with these systems on an individual level. And we see this again when COVID-19 right now is just like raving, we're in the middle of an international pandemic right now. And Black, Indigenous people of color, specifically Black people and Indigenous people and Latinx as well, their deaths, they're just disproportionately, being exposed to COVID, getting COVID, and also dying from COVID. And a lot of people at the beginning were trying to say this was just about Black lifestyles. They just didn't, eat well, they didn't take care of themselves. But in reality, that is completely untrue. In reality, it's the situations that they're living in based on the last 400 years of systemic racism and their current systemic racism. And we could see this, if housing discrimination, if you don't have a decent place to live, you're going to more likely going to be exposed, especially if you're a lot of times, living in poverty and not being able to get decent housing forces you to live in large group homes or shelters or things like that are going to expose you more, high poverty rate, having less, it's easy for me to, just go out and buy a bunch of cleaning supplies, some face masks, things like that. But I mean, if you're living paycheck to paycheck and you just lost your paycheck, it's a different story. And the same with so many other barriers, from lack of access to healthcare to, mass incarceration. Our prison systems are just huge sources of COVID expansion. So all these different systems are in reality the reason why we're seeing Black, Indigenous people and people of color, getting, dying from COVID at disproportionately, high rates outside of white, versus white people. Then we play this James Baldwin clip, and he talks about different types of institutional racism. This was he was in 1964, he was on the Cavett show, and he was kind of debating this, I believe it was like doctor of philosophy, and the doctor said something on the lines of, I'm paraphrasing, that James Baldwin spends too much time focusing on race, and he just needs to be more positive and you know, and something, you know, definitely respectability politics kind of thing. And this is James Baldwin's response.
I don't know what most white people in this country feel, but I can only include what they feel from the state of their institutions. I don't know if white Christians hate Negroes or not, but I know that we have a Christian church which is white and a Christian church which is black. I know, as Malcolm X once put it, the most segregated hour in American life is high noon on Sunday. That says a great deal for me about a Christian nation. It means that I can't afford to trust most white Christians, and certainly cannot trust the Christian church. I don't know whether the labor unions and their bosses really hate me. That doesn't matter, but I know I'm not in their unions. I don't know if the real estate lobby is anything against black people, but I know the real estate lobbies keep me in the ghetto. I don't know if the Board of Education hates black people, but I know the textbooks I give my children to read and the schools that we have to go to. Now, this is the evidence. You want me to make an act of faith, risking myself, my wife, my woman, my sister, my children, on some idealism which you assure me exists in America, which I have never seen.
All right. Love James Baldwin. All right. So another part of these systems, and why what makes these systems so dangerous, is a lot of these systems are invisible to a lot of people, particularly white people on the top. I mean, they're designed to be like that. They're designed in order to perpetuate themselves to where the main benefactors of these systems do not actually see them. And so when, you know, marginalized groups start talking about these systems, unless you've done your own research, or done, you know, had your own experiences to kind of expose that, most white people deny, you know, they don't know what people are talking about. So I'll read this really great quote from Dr. Robin DiAngelo. It says, although white supremacy has shaped Western political thought for hundreds of years, it is never named. In this way, white supremacy is rendered invisible, while other political systems, socialism, capitalism, fascism, are identified and studied. In fact, much of white supremacy's power is drawn from its invisibility to taken for granted aspects that underwrite all political and social contracts. So that's true. I mean, we spend so much time in school learning about, you know, these political systems, socialism, capitalism, economic systems, you know, fascism. We study democracy. We study all these things, but we don't study one of the most influential systems that has, you know, really shaped, you know, for the last 400, you know, I'd say 600 years, you know, has really shaped our world. We don't study that. We don't even name it. You know, that's white supremacy. And there's a couple of reasons for why is, you know, white supremacy is so good at hiding. You know, one, I just said we have a very Eurocentric, whitewashed history that, you know, top down we teach, you know, we teach colonialism as like, you know, expansion of civilization and things like that, when in reality it was the complete opposite. It destroyed civilizations and you know, brought, you know, horrible brutality. So we, you know, teach this white exceptionalism, American exceptionalism, you know, that America, you know, has done no harm. We've always been in the right, when in reality we have been, you know, one of the worst. You know, we've been in the wrong more than we've been in the right, and we've done horrific things. It's not to say, you know, it's not to shame us. It's more for us just to accept our history, so we know how to like kind of move forward and how to fix the last, you know, and the same with the lost cause. We're going to talk a lot more about in our whitewashing history class about the lost cause of Confederacy, but this idea that after the Civil War, you know, even though the South lost the war, in many ways they won the cultural war, because they put enormous amount of efforts and resources into redefining, you know, rewriting the history of the Civil War, you know, glorifying, you know, Civil War, you know, Confederacy generals. Most of these statues were actually built in the early 1900s, during Plessy vs. Ferguson, and most of them were built in the 60s, and they were direct responses to civil rights efforts, you know, trying to, you know, repaint this country as a white supremacy country, and that slavery wasn't that bad, you know, black people are just complaining too much. It was more about states' rights, which was completely not true. It had nothing to do with states' rights. It had 100% was about slavery. They even imposed states' rights, you know, particularly the rights of northern states, you know, to not enact the Fugitive Slave Act. They actually, when they left, and you know, they all the states left when they left, you know, left the Union for the Confederacy, they all had declarations, and all of them said that we're supporting white supremacy, we're supporting slavery, we actually, oppose, the right of northern states to not, support our slave systems, and yeah, but it's just the history's been completely rewritten, and it's just shocking how much that's still ingrained in our history, in our curriculum, in our schools. Racial segregation. Majority of white people are living in bubbles. They have no, friends of Black, Indigenous people of color friends, and that's so they don't see the negative consequences. They don't see that, so it's more, so it stays more hidden. So they don't see the consequences of systemic racism. Moral authority is a big one. Like in a white supremacy society, we have the white people, because they're in power, they're the ones that get to define, what's right or wrong, what's racist and not racist. We're the ones that define racism as, this personal explicit choice that, and then this other, these bad people that do some racist, but we fix most of it. So, but in reality, this is something that we're all part of. But we very specifically just, define this as something that we're, that the other that we're not part of. And also a lot of racism. Our last section, we're going to talk about the rise of race-neutral racism. So a lot of racism that are from systems that don't intend to be racist at all. We're going to talk a lot. We'll give this example a lot about school shootings. Especially starting with the Calabines shooting last couple of decades. In order to actually protect our kids, there's been a huge, movement to put police in our schools, and the response to these school shootings. And these efforts are meant, the intention of these efforts is to protect our kids against school shooters. No one's saying let's do this to hurt, Black students. But in reality, we know that, with the school prison pipeline, we know that Black students are treated differently, are treated harsher, are punished more easily, or have a higher chance of experiencing police brutality from police in school. So by putting more cops in schools, the end result is Black students are experiencing more negative consequences, or being brutalized more, expelled, thrown in school to prison pipeline. So even though that wasn't never intended to be a racist outcome, the outcome is still racist. So that's how a lot of our racism happens, is coming from these systems that don't intend to be racist at all. So I want to read this last quote. We talked a little bit already about how white supremacy it becomes this norm. The good, the beautiful, the professional is white, and everything non-white is the complete opposite. And then that's important to understand too, because men, you don't actually have to defend. If white supremacy is the norm, you don't have to defend white supremacy. You could defend things like our way of life. I just want to defend my way of life, which is a big response on why a lot of people voted for Trump in 2016. So they want to defend their way of life. They felt like they're losing their way of life. They felt like, they're losing, civility, decency, things like that. And these are all just, well, if your way of life is white supremacy, then you're basically saying you're feeling like you're losing your white supremacy. So it kind of masks, having white as the norm kind of masks this, what it really is when you defend the norm. So I'm going to read this last quote from The Racial Contract by Charles W. Mills. White supremacy is an unnamed political system that has made the modern world what it is today. You will not find the term in introductory or even advanced texts in political theory, but though it covers more than 2,000 years of Western political thought and runs ostensibly a gamut of political systems, there will be no mention of a basic political system that has shaped the world for the past several hundred years. And this omission is not accidental. It reflects the fact that standard textbooks and courses have, for the most part, been written and designed by whites who take their racial privilege so much for granted that they do not even see it as a political, as a form of domination. Ironically, the most important system of recent global history, the system of domination by which white people have historically ruled over, and in certain important ways continues to rule over non-white people, is not seen as a political system at all. So I'm going to play this. It's a really great poet, Guante. I'm going to play this poem, or stand-up poetry, spoken word. Sorry, I'm going to play the spoken word about the difference between white supremacy and white supremacists.
how to explain white supremacy to a white supremacist. Sometimes you are a lit match dropped into a boiling ocean. Sometimes you are a stray dog, proud of the sunrise after a long night of barking at the moon. Sometimes you scream at the television, shadowbox mushroom clouds, your hand-to-hand hatred outclassed, outdated. You, post-apocalyptic litter bug. You, venomous spider in the basement of a burning building. You, whose anger is so vast and so empty. All teeth and no mouth, no jaw muscles, just that white rattle. Remember, white supremacy is not a shark, it's the water. It is how we talk about racism as white hoods and Confederate flags, knowing that you own those things and we don't. As if we didn't own this history too, this system. We tread water, and you chum in a bucket. How many skinheads do you think are in the room when they said immigration law? Or decide curriculum for public schools, or push policies like redlining, mandatory minimum sentencing, benign neglect, gentrification, broken windows, policing, voter ID, stop and frisk, 3 strikes, the drug war. Remember, the eye of the hurricane is the least destructive part. You, meanest glare in the chat room, all poker face and no cards. Was it your politically incorrect YouTube comment that made the median net worth of black families in this country 9% the median net worth of white families? Which individual Donald Trump bigot boogeyman are we supposed to be angry at about the millions of people impacted by discrimination in housing and banking and education and employment and the criminal justice system each year? Remember, sharks kill about 1 person each year. Thousands drown. So, when there is a new name hashtagged each week, when police create more black stars than Hollywood, how long do we keep pointing out the bad apples, ignoring the fact that the orchard was planted on a mass grave? And that we planted it there. Because of course, this isn't really a poem for white supremacists, right? Like, I don't know any white supremacists, but I know a lot of people in my neighborhood and in my family, and I know myself, and I know how white supremacy is upheld, whether through our action, our inaction, or just through paying our tuition and taxes. How it isn't just the broken treaty, it is also the treaty. How a gavel can speak as loudly as a grenade. How a white frat boy in blackface on Halloween and his friend who knows it's wrong but doesn't say anything begins to blur together. How the real racists today are very often not even racist. Those teeth sharper when smiling, sharper still when smiling, meaning it. Burning cross is so dramatic. Just say, I don't see race. Just say, we all have an equal chance if we just work hard. Just say, all lives matter. Just say nothing. Surround yourself with others who say nothing and convince yourself that silence is the only song, this muted underwater melody, this pulsing quiet. And when a chorus blooms in Baltimore, when trumpets sound in Ferguson, in Minneapolis, when every one of our cities breaks into song, will we hear it? Will we choose to listen? Or will we just continue treading water, watching for that great white shark, not realizing that we're drowning?
Really love that poem. A couple lines in particular. It's not just a broken treaty, but the actual treaty. And we're going to really dive into, next month and more about that, just like the colonization of America, and just how insane it was, and how we hid behind legal, treaties and legal and legislation and things. We hid the ethnic cleansing and the genocide. How we talk about bad apples, when the orchard was planted on a mass grave, and that we planted it there. Just some of these lines, it's just really powerful. It really makes us understand how, just individualizing these, we should still confront individualizations of racism, of, white supremacists and things, but we also at the same time need to understand this is a bigger system that we all are part of, and we all need to dismantle. So that brings up, up to this idea. One of the reasons why, we don't see, dismantle a lot of these systems, and we haven't seen a whole lot of change, is because there is these things called like system justification, and this idea, this myth of a meritocracy. It makes me think, when I was growing up, I grew up in this white steel town in Ohio. I later found out it was actually a sundown town. Which we'll talk more about sundown towns later, but that's when Black people by the millions were escaping the South after, during Jim Crow. They were going to the North and West, and hundreds and thousands of towns. And then the backlash was a lot of these towns create all these policies to ethnically cleanse white people from their town, or people, Black people from their towns. A lot of them, they would put up signs saying, "Don't let that, the sun go down on you," inward, and that's where the name Sundown Town came, is basically like that movie Green Book, was all about a real book that kind of helped you navigate sundown towns and made sure, help people know who the friendly people were when Black people were traveling around the country. Even though I haven't seen the movie and I heard it was pretty far from the actual history. It was very white centered, but that's the general idea of the Green Book, was like navigating sundown towns. So that was, I grew up in that. The result was that, all my friends, family, schools, classmates, everything was completely white. I mean, there were some, Black people, but they lived in poor neighborhoods and different groups, and we just assumed they just weren't, they didn't mingle with us because it was preference. But the reality is, like, no one ever taught me that Black people were inferior. No one taught me racist ideas, but instead they taught me that this country was fair. That we lived in a meritocracy. If you worked hard, you were successful. If you were lazy, you weren't successful. And that made me come to racist conclusions on my own. And that's where it really gets powerful. It's not so much when you tell people racist ideas, but you when you get them to come to racist conclusions on their own. That's the stuff that really settles into people's internalized beliefs. And it took me a long time to get past that. I would think white people just had most of the wealth and lived in the nice neighborhoods because they worked harder, and Black people were just they just probably didn't work as hard. That's why they lived in poverty. In my town, if all my experiences with police were good, so I just assume when I hear about Black people being brutalized on the news, I would just assume that this is something that had to happen because they must have done something and they needed to be controlled, and so the last resort kind of thing by honest police. And homeless people, I just assume were, lazy, protesters, were just ungrateful because they didn't realize how great this country was, So I came to these conclusions myself, and that's and all because of the idea of I was taught that this country was a meritocracy. And when you teach this stuff, and then to our youth, and then our youth see the inequalities that are happening, they rationalize. The only way they can rationalize it is with racist beliefs and racist views. And I really do believe that's one of the main reasons why it's so ingrained in our society these days. And we need to get away from teaching that this is a fair system, meritocracy. There's so much more beyond that. And at the same time, there's a lot of literature coming out about just the harmful impacts, the mental impacts of students of color, of Black students, who are going into these schools and being taught meritocracy, and then they go back into their communities of gross, inequalities and concentrated poverty and brutalized by police, and just to see that, I mean, that in itself is building internalized racism towards themselves. And like we have to get away from this. There's so much negative impacts on both white and Black students teaching these ideas. Now I'll read this last quote. Elizabeth Martinez, she wrote this really great article about the creation myth and its premise keepers. By not seeing that racism is systemic, part of a system, people often personalize or individualize racist acts. For example, they would reduce racist police behavior to a few bad apples who need to be removed, rather than seeing it as this in police departments all over the country and as a basic to the society. This mistake has real consequences. Refusing to see police brutality as part of a system, and that the system needs to be changed, means that brutality will continue. And then, you know, when I just end, I've already shown this once, but just a reminder when we're talking about systems, this is one of the major outcomes of this, of racist systems. You know, Robin DiAngelo in their quote, we use the term white supremacy to refer to a social, political, economic system of domination based on racial categories that benefit those defined and perceived as white. This system rests on a historic and current accumulation of structural power that privileges, centralizes, and elevates white people as a group. And this is that direct outcome of the last 400 years and current, you know, systemic racism. It's just, you know, we have, you know, white people own most of the wealth. They dominate the control of this country. They get to decide what is read, you know, what is taught, you know, what is, you know, produced in TVs. You know, it's this is what, you know, white supremacy is the outcome is.